What is ownership? The largest challenge we face in fixing what went wrong in corporate America is to ensure that the giant institutions of investment America, largely retirement funds and mutual funds, behave like owners. The trustees and managers of these plans are not true owners. They are intermediaries who act on behalf of the beneficiaries, corporate employees, pensioners, and fund shareholders, to whom they owe a fiduciary duty of loyalty and care. Part of the reason for their failure is that they face conflicting, often self-serving diversions from that responsibility. The massive substitution of fiduciary ownership for personal ownership is one of the major challenges of 21st century capitalism. Remember that only 50 years ago, institutional ownership was inconsequential. Today, institutions hold 66% of all stock. Direct ownership, then, has tumbled from virtually 100% to 34%. True stock owners, investors who own stock directly in their own right and for their own benefit, are becoming an endangered species. The first task, then, is to demand that the financial intermediaries that dominate investment America put the interests of those they serve as their first and overriding priority. We must strengthen the traditional fiduciary law, now only loosely administered by the states in which corporations are chartered. We ought to consider whether federal chartering of corporations, something that, as it happens, was debated at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, would be wise. All those years ago, James Madison argued that the new federal government should be authorized to charter corporations. But as author Roger Lowenstein describes it, federal charters smacked of royal perquisites, so it was left to the states to write the rules. Delaware, through its utter permissiveness, became the corporate residence of choice, much as the Cayman Islands is a paper domicile for secrecy-minded bankers. To this day, more than half of America's largest companies are incorporated in its second smallest state. Delaware laws are so lax, they don't even require publishing an annual report. If federal chartering is an impossible dream, then we need far stronger state regulation of corporations. Perhaps a uniform state code that will obviate the likelihood of corporate venue selection, in which firms, in a sort of Gresham's law in which bad governance drives out good, seek the states that provide the safest harbors for managements. So perhaps we ought to consider giving shareholders the right to ratify the state of incorporation. But make no mistake about it. Any idea of a uniform code of fiduciary duty among the several states would require years of massive effort and cooperation that at least today seem hard to come by. What is essential, finally, is that the last line owners, the investors themselves, demand high standards of trusteeship from those who represent their ownership interests. In mutual funds, those 95 million direct owners have no individual power, but awesome collective power. These fund investors need to understand what investing and trusteeship are all about, and by voting with their feet, gradually gravitate to fund organizations that are serious about putting their interest first. In retirement plans, while the contributors to the thrift plans and the beneficiaries of pension plans presently have no mechanism for bringing about the same result, they surely deserve some formal legal voice in establishing standards of conduct for the trustees of the assets that have been set aside to fund their retirements. The law is clear that retirement plan fiduciaries have duties of loyalty and prudence. We need further articulation of what exactly those words mean and the standards by which their achievement will be measured. Action steps. It is time to begin the process of reform that will ultimately enable Investment America to fulfill its responsibilities of corporate governance. Our institutional investors need more than the motivation to vote proxies, however. They need both the opportunity and the ability to take action. Public policy should move in the direction of facilitating investor access to corporate proxies, allowing submission of proposals to establish governance standards and to eliminate governance restrictions, to accept or reject mergers, to set standards for executive compensation and stock options, and, for that matter, to establish dividend policy, legitimate issues for all substantial investors interested in enhancing the intrinsic value of the corporation. While opening access to large, long-term, and responsible owners would carry some costs, proxy solicitation costs, legal costs, management focus, and other frictional costs, these costs would consume only a tiny fraction of the resources of most corporations and be vastly outweighed by the benefits garnered by owners. I would also add a federal preemption of state law on issues that concern shareholders' rights and directors' duties, and take steps to preclude the obvious kinds of troublemaking foolishness by limiting such access to groups of investors who have held, say, at least 10% of shares outstanding for at least 2 years. In addition, I would allow director nominations on a similar basis, albeit bereft of the overbearing limitations proposed by the SEC. Power to the long-term owners is a reform whose time has come. An editorial in The Economist entitled "American Corporate Governance, No Democracy Please, We're Shareholders" put it this way: in the face of hysterical opposition from corporate bosses who can think of nothing worse than being humiliated in a genuine election, the Securities and Exchange Commission summoned up enough spirit to propose a small step in the direction of genuine shareholder democracy. Yet the proposal is, if anything, too timid. The SEC should implement this modest rule change forthwith. It might then consider adopting another quite modest proposal, a rule long observed in more shareholder-friendly places such as Britain. If by withholding support shareholders cast more votes against a candidate than in favor, he should not be elected to the board. How daringly democratic. In the United States, a similar rule that counted withheld votes as votes against a director would radically change the dynamics of our corporate governance, and for the better. But as even modest proposals for reform struggle for traction, such a sweeping proposal is a long way down the road. That said, I am most gratified by the SEC's recent willingness to allow shareholder proposals that would require a majority vote of shares for the election of any director. Some 81 such proposals have been submitted during the 2005 proxy season, garnering 41% approval at Citigroup and 48% at Gannett, with 13 more companies agreeing to consider the issue. But even with existing restrictions, as I discussed earlier, owners have the power to make their will felt in some areas. They don't need to remain asleep at the switch until broad access rights are at last permitted. While we clearly need important structural changes if we are to enhance corporate democracy, financial institutions should not underestimate their existing ability to effect change. Today, if only we summon the courage to exercise the voting franchise we already have, institutional owners hold the power to be a major force for change. To recapitulate, investors already can and should withhold votes for board chairmen who are also CEOs. Remember the difference between boss of the business and boss of the board. Vote against auditors who are also providing consulting services or receiving consulting service fees that are disproportionate to their audit fees. Withhold votes for board members who serve on audit committees, compensation committees, and governance committees when their qualifications or their independence seem doubtful. Vote for proposals to reverse limits on open governance, for example, staggered boards. Vote against proposals that excessively protect companies from takeovers, such as poison pills. Provisions that are designed to enable companies to negotiate a higher price in the face of hostile takeover attempts are quite another matter. Perhaps most meaningful of all, vote against overly dilutive stock option plans. As the most pronounced vestige of managers' capitalism, stock option plans are a vital battleground on which to fight for a return of owners' capitalism. Owners must demand severe limits, not only when management proposes excessive share dilution, but also when the cumulative share dilution, actual and potential, over time exceeds reasonable limits. Now that the costs of fixed-price stock options seem highly likely to be accounted for as an expense, of all things, owners should also demand better forms of options with the kind of owner-oriented terms described in Chapter 3. While my recommendations for enabling institutional shareholders to exercise the awesome power that lies King Kong-like at their fingertips may seem radical and idealistic, they pale by comparison with the recommendations made by Benjamin Graham in the first edition of The Intelligent Investor nearly half a century ago. For example, he suggested that when a company's results are well below average, an independent committee of stockholders retain outside business engineers to evaluate the policies and competence of management, paid for by the company, or the appointment of specialized experienced directors to evaluate the company's results and report directly to stockholders. In all, Graham expected and indeed assumed that substantial stockholders would be well-informed, diligent, and eager to act in their own self-interest. One can only imagine the horror of the corporate managers if Graham's proposals were to be advanced today. Call in outside business engineers? An independent committee of stockholders? Cost paid by the company? Demand by existing agencies to investigate management efficiency? In today's version of manager's capitalism, these ideas seem almost quaint. But Graham's call for action is now more important than ever. It is not my contention that the Institutional 100 can manage American business. It cannot. Indeed, it could be rightly argued that our institutional investors are far from perfect in the way that they manage themselves. Nor do I believe that once granted a level playing field that establishes ownership rights for qualified long-term investors, the present proxy process will become a quagmire of ill-meaning nominations and proposals by ill-informed owners. I reiterate two overriding principles. 1. That no changes can take place unless a majority of shares are voted in favor, and 2. That all changes approved by the majority must be implemented by the board. If we have mechanisms in place that clearly establish the rights of substantial owners to intervene in governance matters and matters of major policy, dividend payments, executive compensation, option plans, and the like, then the behavior of corporate directors will move in the direction of putting the interest of the shareholder first. Real change will come then, not in the form of continual confrontation with corporate managers and boards of directors, but in the form of the omnipresent reminder that there is a constituency of owners and that it has a strong voice. Faced with the latent power of investment America, the key gatekeepers of corporate America, members of the nation's boards of directors, will again honor their traditional role as stewards of the shareholders' assets. Corporate democracy, if you will yield Republican governance.